Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Timor-Leste is one of the world's youngest democracies, but its journey to independence after Portuguese and then Indonesian occupation was long and bloody. Australia's position on the question of Timor-Leste's independence post-World War II evolved in the context of the Cold War and fears of the spread of communism. Joining me to discuss the history of Timor-Leste is Dr. Peter Jobe, someone who himself has borne witness to much of the fight for independence during the 1970s. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Peter.
Thank you, and it's very good to be here, Georgina.
It's great to have you here at the Robert Menzies Institute, and you've written this book, A Narrative of Denial, Australia and the Indonesian Violation of East Timor, published by MUP, good friends of the Robert Menzies Institute. And it's a fascinating story and obviously the result of some many years of research and, of course, personal experiences as well. Can you tell me about those experiences you had in East Timor in the 1970s?
Well, I should explain, I wasn't in East Timor. I was supporting the Timorese struggle for independence from Australia.
You're in Darwin, weren't you?
That's right.
Yes, apologies.
I was Darwin-based for some time. I should explain I was very young at the time. Now, I can't say I had a great ideology. My involvement came when I met Timorese people and other activists, and I discovered the horrendous situation that was happening in East Timor at the time.
And you met them in Darwin?
I met them in Darwin.
Yeah.
I met some Australian activists and Timorese people. One of the ones who influenced me a lot was Brian Manning, who was the activist, the mainstay of the radio link between Fretilin and Australian activists that was maintained from 1975 until 1978.
Tell me about this radio link, though. So this was coming from Darwin into East Timor?
That's right. Well, before the invasion, it was anticipated, of course, that the invasion was going to happen.
This is Indonesia's invasion into East Timor. Yeah.
Brian and a number of actors travelled to East Timor and they established the radio link. They left behind a portable transceiver that could be carried around. And when the Indonesians started to invade, Aloysius Fernandes, who was the Fretilin information minister at the time, started to broadcast from the very first day. He broadcast the horrors of the first day of the invasion, but then managed to evacuate to the countryside and lived with Fretilin in the countryside until late 1978.
With this transceiver the whole time?
With the transceiver.
Oh, amazing.
Sending broadcasts every few days.
Oh. And so you came across Brian Manning and others in Darwin. Was it at that time that you thought this is a cause I feel really committed to? Is it?
Yes, it was, because I also met Timorese people and became friends with them, and they had their families in East Timor at the time. And I should explain, as you probably know, there was a very high death toll during the Indonesian occupation, and most of it occurred during those early years. There was an artificially caused famine caused by Indonesian policies of defoliating crops and destroying the countryside to force Fretilin surrenders and to target the civilian population so they couldn't support Fretilin. We knew horrendous things were happening. They were coming across the radio and they were coming from other sources as well. And they needed a volunteer to do a minor job, which was, for me, simply monitoring the Australian part of it. I should say that there was another part of the radio link that was actually illegal. It was a clandestine network, which was an operator transmitting in return to East Timor. But he couldn't come into town all the time to take all the tapes because it would give his position away too easily. So we set up this second monitoring station, and I simply did that job when I was 20 for about 6 months, recording. Some days, maybe every 3 to 4 days, there would be a reception, but you had to be listening every morning. As you probably know, shortwave radio can only work properly either in the evening or in the morning, so I had to listen.
I did not know that.
Right.
Oh.
So it was a set time of the day, 7 in the morning. I'd record the messages and take them down to Brian Manning, who would then send them to the activist community. It would be sent to Jose Ramos-Horta, who was the Fretilin representative in New York at the time, and to Fretilin external headquarters in Mozambique. And, of course, the information from it was also distributed through newsletters and sometimes through the Australian mainstream media. The ABC used to cover it, and so did the Australian newspaper, and so did the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald and a number of others, although it was mostly through newsletters that were produced by the Campaign for an Independent East Timor and the Australian East Timor Association in Melbourne.
So Peter, before we get on to what was happening to Timor at this time, which, as you say, I mean, many, many lives were lost. 200,000 lives, I think, were lost during this time, which is an enormous number of people for quite a small population, particularly. But East Timor had been a Portuguese colony since the 16th century. And then in World War II, there was obviously Japanese had come through Southeast Asia. But what was the status of East Timor after World War II in the eyes of the international community? And then I think the other perspective, which is interesting, is what was its status in the eyes of the Indonesians?
Well, it was still officially retained the status of a Portuguese colony. Australia, in the immediate aftermath, actually assisted the Portuguese upon their return to East Timor. And, of course, the Portuguese were in East Timor for 400 years. They left it in a very undeveloped state. The kind of colonial model they used was a very exploitative one that did not develop most of East Timor in any reasonable manner. Portuguese were able to return. There was some discussion, interestingly, in the early 60s between Robert Menzies and Portuguese dictator Salinger about the future of East Timor. Menzies actually wanted it to be decided through the United Nations. And I think this is a bilateral policy. Labour would have felt the same, that they realised that the long-term continuation of Portuguese rule was not viable, but Salinger refused to acknowledge that, so nothing came of that correspondence. It should be said it was thought by Australia from quite an early stage that East Timor was too small to be viable, but that was not based on a strong evidence base.
That was just a feeling?
That was just a feeling, yes.
Right, yeah.
And in fact, finally, in 1974, the Joint Intelligence Organisation actually did a number of economic assessments, and they reached the conclusion that it could be independent, that it would continue to be a poor country, but it would require no more aid than it would probably receive if it were incorporated, and that it was, in fact, a larger country than many others in the South Pacific that have become independent. So
at the UN, it was considered a good candidate for self-determination, wasn't it? There was an expectation that the East Timorese would eventually become an independent nation state. But the Indonesians had a very different view, didn't they?
Well, I should say the Indonesians were actually initially split within the Suharto regime. There were different factions pulling in different directions. The Foreign Minister, Adam Malik, he had been a youth activist for Indonesian independence. And he was actually reasonably sympathetic.
And that came in 1949, didn't it?
That's right.
Dutch, yes.
And Australia had a positive role, and the Indonesians acknowledged that in supporting their independence movement. Malik actually met Jose Ramos Horta in Jakarta in 1974, and he gave him a letter saying that Indonesia would be prepared to accept a self-determination process and a friendly relationship if it did decide to be independent with the future of East Timor. However, within the Suharto regime, there was another group called the OPSIS group that were pushing in the opposite direction. And they were a very hardline group that had been involved in suppressing the Indonesian Communist Party in the 1960s. They did not want to accept any sort of independent East Timor which could take a different political position to their own. Australia, I should say, had the option of supporting Adam Malik. They were aware of that letter. Jose Ramos Horta came to Australia and showed it to departmental officials, relatively low-level departmental officials, I should say, because that's all they let him meet with. But Whitlam, from an early stage, just assumed that an independent East Timor would not be viable. He saw Indonesia through the lens of anti-colonialism, but Whitlam was also very supportive of the Suharto regime when it came to power. In 1967, quite soon after he became opposition leader, he wrote an article for The Australian setting out the Labor agenda. And he devoted a surprising amount of it to Indonesia. He said we should welcome this new development in Indonesia that makes us a lot more secure, because the Suharto regime, of course, was pro-Western, even though they'd very ruthlessly suppressed the Indonesian Communist Party in 1965 and 1966.
Yes, 500,000 people were killed, weren't they?
That's right.
In the suppression of the communists in Indonesia.
Around that, well, we don't know the actual figure, but that is considered pretty much a baseline figure. Nevertheless, Whitlam, and it was a fairly bipartisan position, that this was considered a good thing and that the Suharto regime was described by Australian officials, diplomatic officials, as a moderate pro-Western regime. Whether you can call a regime that has killed so many people moderate, of course, is a matter of interpretation, but that is how they viewed it because it was a pro-Western regime. So they saw the simple solution to East Timor would be that it would go the way of Goa, which of course had been easily quite incorporated into India.
Can you tell me, by way of background, Peter, about the historical and cultural reasons why East Timor was considered different from Indonesia? I mean, obviously the Dutch and the Portuguese had been colonial administrators of the two different parts of the territory. But I mean, were there very deep-seated differences in the people and the sort of the culture as it had developed over the centuries?
Well, obviously the West Timorese share a reasonable amount in common.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that colonialism can do this.
Yes.
And it did cause an East Timorese identity to develop. And it developed 74 and 75. They did have a strong sense of their own independence. You can read the account of Jim Dunn, who went and visited the territory, first of all, on behalf of the Australian government as an official delegation, and then on behalf of Community Aid Abroad. And he said there was a strong sense of a developing Timorese identity. Now, East Timor, or West Timor as well, of course, is very diverse. It has many different language groups. But they developed a common language, Tetum, which was a lingua franca. And under Portuguese rule, they did develop a sense that they were different.
Yeah.
Perhaps I should go back and explain Whitlam's position and his actions. Very soon after, there was a Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which overthrew the old regime.
Can you explain why it was called the Carnation Revolution? Because I thought that was quite interesting reading about that.
It was called the Carnation Revolution because it was a military coup supported by a section of the military, but it was widely supported by the population who came out in the streets to support them, and some of them threw carnations at the troops to show that they supported them.
And didn't they put the carnations in the rifles?
I think they might have, yes. They did that. And that's why there were some photographs taken, and that's why it was called the Carnation Revolution.
Yeah, yeah.
But soon after that, he sent his personal private secretary, Peter Lewinsky, to meet with a guy called Harry Chan, who was a very hardline member of the Opsis faction that opposed Adam Malek's position and wanted to push East Timor to incorporation. On behalf of Whitlam, Peter Lewinsky told Chan that Australia did not want an independent East Timor. They thought it was unviable. After that, Harry Chan and his faction approached the Australian embassy, and they informed the Australian embassy that they had sent a paper to Suharto advocating for a program to destabilise the independence or self-determination process that had been instigated by the new Lisbon regime. First of all, it would include a strident radio broadcast from West Timor, undermining different groups and trying to set different groups amongst them. It had a military component, infiltrating people. They attempted to divide the different factions within East Timor and set them against each other, and they were ultimately successful. But it's interesting that that process was instigated by Australia, by Peter Lewinsky, who was sent on behalf of Gough Whitlam, while Adam Malek was trying to push in another direction.
You said Australia was concerned that East Timor would not be a viable independent nation and that there were sort of misconceptions around why that was the case. But how much was a concern over political elements in East Timor that, given nationhood, might actually set in motion concerns around the spread of global communism? Because I mean, this is where you have a political party like Fretilin, that there are concerns in Australia and in other places that it had links to communism and that East Timor could become this sort of part of a wave. You'd seen Vietnam fall to the communists, you'd seen Laos fall to the communists, Cambodia. There was certainly a lot of communist regimes taking power in Southeast Asia at this time. Was the Whitlam government perhaps seeing a trend that could unfold if it was party to supporting an independence movement in East Timor with a political party like Fretilin?
Australia was certainly aligned with the United States in that regard, and they were concerned about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. However, the evidence is actually gone through literally tens of thousands of Department of Foreign Affairs documents and a number of other sources I've witnessed. I've interviewed departmental officers. From an early stage, they were aware that Fretilin was not a communist entity. It was originally called the Association of Timorese Democrats, giving itself a name of social democrats rather than communists. Of course, there were different factions in it. There were some hardline left factions, although the evidence does not suggest that they were the most prominent figures within it or part of the leadership. And Nicola Lobato and Jose Ramos Horta and other leaders were relatively moderate. They wanted an independent East Timor, and they were prepared to even at one stage to go into coalition with the more conservative party, UDT, to achieve an independent East Timor and work with them to it. So the early assessments, Alan Taylor, for example, was an officer from the Jakarta embassy who visited East Timor in both 1974 and 1975. He wrote that Fretilin was not a communist organisation, although he noted, of course, that it had a left faction, as did, of course, the Australian Labor Party at the time. If you actually look at Fretilin actions, they did have some hard heads within them, but most of their actions were relatively moderate.
So was it just the actions of the left faction that gave Fretilin the reputation of being a communist party?
Well, it was not considered a communist party by Australia. Most of people who were well informed knew that it wasn't a communist party. Now, they chose to change their name from Association of Timorese Democrats to Fretilin, which was reminiscent of Frelimo in Mozambique, and which was a Marxist party. Now, that might have set a few bells ringing.
Yeah.
They also instigated, they were committed to land reform and rural education and health programs. To the hardliners in Indonesia, that was a little reminiscent of the Indonesian Communist Party.
I see.
But the evidence doesn't suggest that Fretilin were a hardline Marxist group at all.
So was it the Indonesians, perhaps, who were pushing
It was one faction within the Indonesians who were pushing this faction.
Yeah.
The Indonesian Foreign Ministry was pushing in the other direction. As I discuss in my book, the evidence suggests that Suharto was initially unsure of which way to go. And it was because of the strong impetus that the Australian position had that pushed him to support OPSIS rather than Adam Malik. And had Australia worked through the official channels of the Indonesian Foreign Ministry to support a process of self-determination. And I'm just saying that in a normal diplomatic way, it would not have even required a large Australian intervention, just making it known that they supported a process of self-determination and for Indonesia to accept an outcome. There was some discussion within the department, and there was also discussion in Fretilin, which was the possibility of a treaty of understanding and friendship with Indonesia for independent East Timor did come to power. So there was a clear road that was possible without confrontation with Indonesia to support a process of self-determination.
The Indonesians then proceed to invade East Timor. How did the Australian government respond to this invasion?
The Australian government is an interesting time because Whitlam had just been sacked a few weeks before. The government at the time was the caretaker government of Malcolm Fraser, and the caretaker foreign minister was Andrew Peacock. Now, Andrew Peacock did a bit of about-face because before he became foreign minister, he actually was friends with Jose Ramos Horta and stood on platforms with him. And he was very critical of Whitlam's position. When he came to power, he did a quick about-face.
Sorry, why was he critical of the Whitlam position?
He
saw the genuine aspirations of East Timor's independence as valid?
He called it a regional process to support a process of self-determination rather than necessarily supporting the Indonesian position.
What made Andrew Peacock, I guess, what drew him to their plight, the East Timorese plight? Because of all the countries in the world he could have been focusing on, I mean, of course, they're on Australia's doorstep, but it would have been, I'm sure, in the mid-1970s, not potentially what a very ambitious, and he, of course, goes on to be leader of the Liberal Party and opposition leader, ambitious politician might have, it was not necessarily the obvious choice for a political cause, an international cause to jump on.
Well, First of all, he was isolated within the Liberal Party, and that was one of the reasons why he changed his position, because he came under strong position, particularly from Fraser, to change that position. But he styled himself as a Liberal internationalist. Remember, he had actually been the minister responsible for the decolonisation of Papua New Guinea before Whitlam came to power. He, of course, he called himself a political conservative, and he was, but he believed in liberal internationalism to a certain extent.
So he would have seen the liberation of East Timor as part of a progression of decolonisation across sort of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, like he'd seen in Papua New Guinea.
Well, he called it support for self-determination rather than independence, because it's with the context that Timor should consider its own position. But he changed his position very abruptly when he came to power, when he became foreign minister. He came under a great deal of pressure from the Department of Foreign Affairs, which had already been working very strongly with the Indonesians. There was a whole series of briefings by the OPSIS hardline faction to the Australian embassy, telling them everything they were doing, telling them about how they were undermining the decolonisation process. And that went in two stages. There was a coup in September 1975 where the UDT attempted to oust Fretilin, instigated by the Indonesians, under pressure from the Indonesians. They had been in coalition government before then. Not coalition government, in coalition before then. Fretilin did not initially declare independence. They wanted the Portuguese to come back, and they asked for assistance from Western nations to return to a decolonisation process. No one was interested. That's when Indonesia launched its second phase of undermining the process, but that was a military phase, sending in Indonesian troops who pretended to be Timorese and engaging in military suppression of Fretilin. And that was when, of course, when the Balabo Five were killed.
And on the Balabo Five, the Whitlam government did not make a statement, did they? There was no sort of protest to the Indonesian government about these Australian journalists who'd been killed in Balabo by Indonesian forces. It was hardly the diplomatic incident that you would have thought it should have turned into.
Well, indeed, I've looked at many, many departmental documents of this at this time. Their main concern, and they say this quite explicitly, it could inflame a public against Indonesia, which they didn't want to happen. They were actively supporting the Indonesian intervention. They were informed at every stage. It was a clandestine, illegal intervention. It was not a civil war. Indonesia framed it as a civil war, and Australia also framed it that way and they used it later to say that Indonesia intervened to stop a civil war, and it wasn't true. There had been a very brief civil war. After that, it was Indonesian troops pretending to be Timorese and fighting Fretilin. Australia didn't react to Balabo, first of all, because they were deeply compromised. They knew all along what had been happening, and that made it difficult for them to turn around against and protest against the people who've been fighting them with these detailed briefings. Also, Whitlam, who was still in power at the time, was not the slightest bit interested. He repeated in Parliament the Indonesian narrative that it was a civil war. And he even said that Indonesia had been very patient under these circumstances, which, of course, was completely untrue.
So the deaths of the Australian journalists in Balabo, they were painted as just casualties of war, they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was just a sort of a terrible, tragic, unfortunate events, but no one was particularly responsible, or?
That was how the Indonesians painted it. They said they shouldn't have been there and they were caught in the crossfire, which of course was completely untrue. Whitlam and the Department of Foreign Affairs went along with the Indonesians. They wanted a statement from the Indonesians about how they died for publicity purposes only. They were not interested in investigating the truth because that would have undermined their policies, and they expected that East Timor would be taken over by the Indonesians. They were far more concerned with the Indonesian relationship.
It's interesting. We need to, I think, recall that 50, 60 years ago, we weren't worried about the threat of China. Like the security hawks in Australia are very, very concerned about rising China and its military modernisation and potential World War III in waters to our north. Back many decades ago, we saw, and you'd see this in defence white papers and planning, the major threat coming from Indonesia. So this relationship that the Australian government was nurturing with the Suharto regime of Indonesia and managing, this was a relationship that is so very different to the relationship today. I mean, we wouldn't at all cross defence strategists' minds that a threat to Australia would come from Indonesia in 2024. But back then and earlier, that's absolutely what was the forefront of strategists' minds. And, of course, in the Australian public's minds too, there was a real fear of Indonesia as an aggressor, wasn't there?
They were certainly concerned about the Sukarno government, which Sukarno, of course,
the independence
was
president,
very much,
yes.
He was very much non-aligned. He wanted a non-aligned position, and they saw him as flirting with China. They didn't believe that Indonesia had the capacity to invade Australia, because it didn't. The Indonesian armed forces at that time would not have been able to do that. But they saw Sukarno was getting old, he wasn't in the best of health, and they greatly feared that the PKI would come to power. And, of course, Australia was involved in Vietnam during that period as well. And for that reason, they supported the US and Australian agenda was very anti-communist. But, of course, there was another motive as well. It wasn't the only motive, but, of course, there was the Timor Sea resources. In 1972, they reached a very favourable agreement with Indonesia about the boundary between Australia and the Indonesian part of West Timor, and they hope to replicate that should Indonesia take over East Timor. Some people have seen that as the primary motive for Australia's support for an Indonesian takeover. Having done a great deal of research on this, I think it was a strong secondary motive. I think the main motive was the strategic support for the Suharto regime and not wanting to have even a small, potentially left-wing entity of East Timor.
Yeah.
I interviewed Richard Woolcott some years ago now, before his death, and we discussed that in East Timor.
We should say Richard Woolcott was Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, but also an Australian ambassador to Indonesia.
That's right. Yeah. He was ambassador from 75 to 78. And he said that a left-wing regime in East Timor would be destabilising. I said, well, you knew very well it wasn't communist because your own embassy officials went to East Timor and wrote that. And he said, oh, yes, but any left-wing entity would have been seen as destabilising. Now, of course, it doesn't even mean what sort of regime would have come to power in East Timor. There's no reason to believe it would have been an extremist regime. If Australia had established good relations with it, it is likely it would have turned in a moderate direction. But nevertheless, that was departmental thinking very strongly. There were some dissidents, I say. There were a number of people, and I discuss it in my book, who wrote papers and advocated for a different position, but they were not influential.
And it's interesting, as you say, that people like Andrew Peacock, who goes from being a shadow Foreign Affairs Minister to Foreign Affairs Minister, changes his position, we can presume, on the basis of Department of External Affairs, I think it was, or was it Foreign Affairs by that stage? Department of Foreign Affairs advice.
He also got a lot of pressure from two sources, from within the Liberal Party and the National Country Party, as it was at that time, and also from the Jakarta Embassy in particular, who advised him that it was too late and he had to change his position, that Indonesia was going to take over in any way, and Indonesia were our friends. East Timor wasn't viable. And, of course, it was also quite clear at this stage how much Australian policy had been compromised. We had received an enormous amount of information. And as one of the officials said at the time, that the Indonesians have shrewdly compromised us. They effectively consulted us. And because we offered no objection, we effectively provided assent for their undermining of the self-determination process.
So you obviously were involved in the receipt of the radio transmissions from East Timor, but how else were we able to get information about what was going on in East Timor during that time?
Well, it started off, first of all, there was the smuggled letters that came out through refugees. There were sources within the Catholic Church, and several of them were very good in trying to provide information. And then there was a thing called the Dunn Report. I mentioned James Dunn before. Now, he'd been consul to East Timor in the early 60s. He was also a former Army intelligence officer who'd been a diplomat for the Australian government. He was the parliamentary research officer at that time. He went to Portugal and Lisbon, and he interviewed many of the refugees who had been able to leave East Timor in the aftermath of the invasion. He interviewed a large number of them, and as he emphasised in his report, including people who were hostile to Fretilin, both sides of the political debate, and they all gave a very, very consistent story of atrocities occurring, of the starvation that was beginning to become evident in February 1977 when he published his report, of the murderous nature of the invasion, of the use of death squads, of the sexual violence, of all the atrocities that have since been confirmed to be true. He published his report in February 1977, and he also went on a tour with it to various European nations and to the United States. The Department of Foreign Affairs worked against him. They cabled all their embassies, giving an alternative narrative, disparaging the evidence that he'd been produced, calling it hearsay. It wasn't hearsay. It was actual testimony from actual witnesses, and those witnesses had indicated they were prepared to talk to foreign officials of Western countries if they wished to. Nevertheless, Australia worked very strongly to produce an alternative narrative and to disparage Dunn's report and claim that the atrocities that he documented and which we now know to be true were not happening.
When was the Dunn report released, Peter?
February 1977.
Okay, so 2 years after the...
A little bit over a year. Yeah. It was December 75 was the invasion, so yes. It was a little bit over a year.
And what was the Portuguese position then on all these issues? You said he's travelled to Portugal, interviewing refugees, collecting their statements. Was the Portuguese government heavily engaged, or?
For the first few years after the invasion, the Portuguese government wasn't engaged. Portugal was in some turmoil at this time. They had ever-changing governments. There was a fight for power between the different factions. It wasn't even clear what sort of government would emerge. There was a Communist Party that was vying for power. And the Portuguese did effectively walk away from East Timor and put it in the too hard basket. They also had a busy colonial agenda because the decolonisation was also happening in their African colonies as well, which were much larger than East Timor. That changed in 1980, however. There was a change of government. There were Portuguese activists rallied for a change, and they were successful in changing the Portuguese government position. From 1980 onwards, Portugal lobbied strongly for East Timor, and they were legally the administrative power. Under United Nations law, they were still the coloniser, and decolonisation had not taken place. It was East Timor was a Portuguese colony under Indonesian occupation. So Portugal acted badly from 75 to 1980. After that, it changed its position. And I should say part of it was in 1975 when Fretilin found themselves in power, not through their own choosing because they'd been forced to respond to a coup against them. They called for a Portuguese return, and if Portugal had actually returned at that stage, it would have been much more difficult for Indonesians to invade. But Portugal was caught up in its own problems and didn't respond.
And what about the Fraser government's activities in the early 80s? There was support, wasn't there, for the Indonesian military, which, of course, leaves some questions about the complicit nature in what was going on in East Timor of the Australian side.
Well, I call my book A Narrative of Denial because I argue in it that Australia was Indonesia's chief publicity outlet. The Indonesians, of course, had their own narrative, but they have only had limited credibility if they had been the only ones saying it. Australia pushed the position, first of all, that the Indonesians, they didn't support the invasion, but you could understand the Indonesian position. They were restoring order to an irresponsible situation and a civil war between the Timorese. Wasn't true, but the Australian government pushed that line at the United Nations and elsewhere.
Did you find, though, evidence that there was, I mean, you said in terms of Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia that there was some debate internally and different views, but was a sort of overarching sense that that civil war narrative was correct?
That was the overarching sense that they pushed in the international agenda when they were speaking at the United Nations. There were 6 resolutions at the UN General Assembly and 2 at the Security Council from 1975 to 1980. Australia lobbied the countries with their agenda, which was first of all of a reluctant Indonesian takeover, and also they lobbied against the claims that there were large atrocities taking place or that there was a major famine taking place. As evidence came in that indeed there was a major death rate and a major famine happening in East Timor, they changed their narrative to blame it on the Timorese, to say this was the responsibility of Timorese causing a civil war and that East Timor had always been on the brink of famine anyway, and that it wasn't the Indonesian military's fault. In fact, it was a deliberate action of what they called encirclement and annihilation by the Indonesians to force people from the countryside into camps so they could undermine Fretilin. And Australia worked very hard at the United Nations and elsewhere in the international community to push the Indonesian narrative.
And what was the position of the United States in all this? They had obviously had a strong interest in good relations with Indonesia, with the Suharto regime, and interesting that Australia and the US had, in the early 60s, actually had quite a difference of opinion on Indonesia. The US really prioritising building up its economic relationship with Indonesia, and Australia being very concerned about the activities communists in Indonesia. But by the late 70s, early 80s, where were the US and Australia in terms of their approach to Indonesia and East Timor? Were they totally in sync?
They were pretty much on the same page.
Yeah.
It's interesting, we talk about the Australia-US alliance. This was actually an example of Australia influencing US policy rather than the other way around. In several meetings that I've read and document in my book between US and Australian officials, they make it clear that they were quite happy for Australia to lead on the Timor issue and to take their line. So the narrative that was reiterated by the United States was very similar to the Australian ones, and the Australians would brief them with their narrative and say that we're the experts on this, we're geographically close to East Timor, and all our evidence suggests this position. Now, of course, most of that evidence only came from briefings from Indonesian officials, which were taken at face value. So Australia had an influence on US foreign policy, first under President Ford, and then under President Carter, and then also after Reagan came to power.
And of course, the narrative of sort of Cold War tensions and communism was still very much a powerful one in the 80s with the Reagan administration. And you would have been speaking to very sympathetic ears by using that type of language.
That's right. And Australia's talked about their common objectives in the region, which was a strategic objective to support pro-Western regimes in the region. And I should say both countries provided the Indonesians with arms. US Bronco aircrafts were very important to the Indonesian offensive and the campaign of encirclement and annihilation. Australia had a military aid program throughout this period to Indonesia. Initially, they asked for and received a verbal undertaking that Australian weapons would not be used. However, in one of the documents, I came across a visit of an Australian official to East Timor in which he says that there were Australian Nomad aircraft on the tarmac of Comoro airfield near Dili, and that those were aircraft that were provided as part of the military aid program. This was before Australia had recognised East Timor as being part of Indonesia. That should have led to something of a diplomatic incident because they were violating that agreement that Australian arms would not be used. But of course, nothing came of it. The Nomad aircraft would have been, by their nature, certainly of assistance to the Indonesian campaign.
Fast forward to the events in the late 90s. What are the lessons we can draw from that? I mean, this is where international pressure shifts again from supporting Indonesia's occupation of East Timor or integration of East Timor to one that is around, well, you should let the East Timorese people have their say through a process towards independence or self-determination.
One of the key matters that caused a change in outlook was the Santa Cruz massacre in 1991. That led to the deaths of hundreds of young Timorese. It was not the first or even the most serious massacre, but there was one difference, is that it was filmed by Max Stahl, who is a British filmmaker. He smuggled the footage out and it was broadcast around the world, and that gave a very different perspective of what was happening. The Timorese Solidarity Campaign and the external Timorese resistance were very good at reframing the narrative. They were very good at countering the false narrative that was being pushed by Indonesia and the West and documenting about what was really happening there. Portugal was also influential. It had joined the European Union by this stage and used its position within the European Union to push for an outcome and a process. But basically, it was a challenging of narratives, of understandings. The world came to see, well, first of all, it wasn't greatly on the international agenda. Most people around the world didn't know where East Timor was outside of Australia, and even there it wasn't covered that much. But it found its place in the international agenda. Support movements were established throughout the world. There were support movements in the United States, in Japan, in Germany, in Denmark, in Portugal, of course, and in Britain, and a number of other nations that made it clear to their own governments that there was public concern about East Timor. This led to, partly because of Portuguese influence within the European Union, a situation under which Indonesian officials were being constantly asked about it when they had international visits. There was also a lot of protests. One of them was when Suharto visited Germany. I think it was 1974, and he was met by extensive protests, including eggs were thrown at him. The Dresden Orchestra refused to play for him, and a number of political parties in their regional government issued statements that he was not welcome. So they gave the Suharto regime a hard time. When B.J. Habibie came to power, he'd been someone who had not been involved.
And this, we should explain, this was after how many years of Suharto being president of Indonesia? It was over 30, wasn't it?
Well, he effectively came to power in 1965, 1966. He officially became president in, I think it was 1967, and it was 1999, I think it was, when he...
So 32 years of Suharto, and his successor is B.J. Habibie.
They wanted to rid himself of the burden of East Timor. And so he was prepared to have effectively an act of self-determination, although it was framed differently because they said they would never have one. They framed it as a referendum on autonomy. But they made it clear that if autonomy didn't win, that they'd let them become independent.
So in your view, there was a really important role to play for an international campaign to push Indonesia to this point, to finally in 1999 to get a concession that they would allow East Timor to have a say on its independence or not, whether it wanted self-determination or not. So that is quite sometimes you think, these, say in West Papua, these protests, they've been going on for decades, to what end? But with the case of East Timor, you can see that did actually have a genuinely powerful effect.
That's right. That was part of the campaign. It was a combination of a number of factors. The Timorese were well organised. Well, they had their military resistance, of course, Palantir. And then there was a youth movement that organised a very effective civil resistance, non-violent civil resistance that organised a lot of protest for people who visited East Timor as it slowly opened to the West. That was supported by a diplomatic campaign, and José Ramos Horta, you have to take your hat off to him. He was very effective, a lobbyist and diplomat in that regard in the international agenda, supported by an international campaign of supporters, of Western supporters in Australia, Germany, Japan, the United States, who came out and made it clear to their governments that they did not consider East Timor to be part of Indonesia, that it was a territory that needed a proper act of self-determination to be able to determine its own future.
Well, Peter, there is so much more to discuss. I know I've told you this before, but I've been a frequent visitor to Timor-Leste and particularly observing its democracy through its electoral processes, and it is very cheering to see how much enthusiasm the Timorese people take to the democracy. And I think Freedom House is reporting that they are actually the freest democracy in Southeast Asia these days, as well as the youngest. So it's a testament to all the years it took to get there that the Timorese people are so fulsome in embracing their independence and democracy and having a say over their own futures. So thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me, and I have to completely agree about what you say about Timorese democracy.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.